After looking at the Mythic Plus situation in 10.1.5, just a few days into 10.1.5, we also have to look at the raid situation. Because looking at the glass half full, the raid situation is not nearly as bad as the Mythic Plus situation. We talked about how the Mythic Plus meta has now been dominated by this Exodia comp of Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Augmentation, Shadow Priest and Fire Mage. In the raid, there is a bit more diversity. It's a bit more varied, there is some more choice. However, some of the better performing specs are still part of that Exodia comp that we have seen in Mythic Plus. So we have a pattern here of some of these buff specs being much better, doing much better compared to the last reset, basically before 10.1.5 launched. The first thing to notice, of course, as soon as we check the difference between the last patch and this patch, is the fact that Fire Mage has now jumped far ahead of everyone else. You know, even if you look at the actual numbers, as you can see, Fire Mage is ahead by quite a significant amount compared to the big chunk of the group. Also, Enhancement Shaman is doing slightly better after being buffed in the last patch. They have just barely lost some AoE, but overall the spec was improved. You had the rework, so to speak, of Frost Mage, which has not improved the spec as much in the raid, or we should say in single target, it's more in AoE damage, and Arcane, which still remains powerful in the raid. But definitely the main standout is that number one, Fire Mage is all the way towards the top, and of course Augmentation Evoker is all the way down towards the bottom. You know, it's the new spec, it's wonky, it plays a little bit differently in the raid than it does in Mythic Plus. The results clearly can vary at the moment. Also, there is some clunkiness to the spec in the sense that still, even though in Warcraft logs the damage is attributed to augmentation, some of the damage, in particular the pet damage, in particular of specs like the Demonology Warlock, don't actually go to the Augmentation Evoker. They are not actually going to be showing up as Augmentation Evoker's damage. So you do see an even weaker version of Augmentation in here, because not all of their damage is being represented in these logs. The other thing you're going to be seeing change is, of course, the healers. And this one is perhaps even bigger. This gap is an even larger gap, by the way, than Season 1 Preservation Evoker. At the moment, the average HPS of Holy Paladin has gapped the rest of the healers by quite a significant amount. Now, it is true that when you look at these rankings, there is something, you know, a little bit suspect, which might change from healer to healer. As you can see, this Holy Paladin is pulling tons of HPS, way more than anyone else by a ridiculous amount with their normal abilities, their normal spells. But once you go down and you check another healer, you might see, for example, that they have the Echoing Tearstone. So this is at the moment what might be ruining the ranks in the raid, because of the power of this trinket, as you can see, allowing you some pretty heavy bursts of healing. So it does differ whether or not your healer has this trinket or doesn't have this trinket, and who is sniping the heals with this trinket better than the others might give you more healing, but definitely not that much healing to make up for this ridiculous difference of Holy Paladin right now in the raid. With the new build, where you're basically a Holy Shock spamming machine in the raid, and even to certain degrees to not really be playing melee anymore. Yes, you still stay in melee range and use your Crusader Strike, etc., but not nearly as much as before. Now you have more freedom with other spells compared to your Crusader Strike. Now it's much less casted compared to before. So this is the main difference for healers in the raid. The rest of the healers, in fact, have remained the same. You have Preservation, Mistweaver, and Restoration being the top 3 in HPS, and the other 3 specs towards the bottom. The only thing that changed is that now Holy Paladin is far ahead of the rest. That's basically the major change. You do have the rankings showing up in here in a little bit more of an even way, even though still Augmentation is suffering a little bit from the issues of their damage being perceived in the raid, which is still not quite working, but you do still see the point of Fire Mage being very good and Demonology still being very good as well. Same goes for the previously already well-performing melee spec, which was Unholy. It's good to remind everyone that basically there were no real significant changes for any of the melee specs, with the exception of enhancement. All of the other melee specs have not really been changed or buffed significantly or nerfed significantly or reworked. They all lost, they all stopped using the amulet because the amulet was nerfed by 40% in damage. They all received some 2 to 4 to 6% damage compensation for the nerf of the amulet, and that's it. So you do have the least amount of changes when it comes to melee DPS. You have, of course, more changes for the range DPS because all of the warlocks were being buffed, the mages were being reworked, augmentation was being added. So of course you had way more of a change when it came to the ranged. For tanks, as usual, tanks are irrelevant in the raid. Doesn't really matter what you're playing. It's usually who is meta in Mythic Plus that becomes meta in the raid as well, which is why Guardian Druid is now suddenly rising up the ranks when it used to be towards the bottom. And then for the healers, you do have OP-aladin as the new S tier spec in the raid, just like they are in Mythic Plus. So as I said, you still do have some of the specs that are currently showing up a lot in Mythic Plus, still doing well in the raid, in particular Fire Mage and Holy Paladin. The other specs though are not nearly as dominant. For example, Augmentation Evoker in the raid is not nearly as strong as Augmentation Evoker in Mythic Plus. You then also have specs like Frost Mage, not nearly as strong in the raid as they are in Mythic Plus. You also have Shadow Priest, which continues to be good in the raid, you know, top half in the raid, but still, you know, they still have their issues on, for example, single target damage. They're not particularly excellent in their damage, and now it's even less so. Now it's even less so because you have mages being buffed, now becoming all better than Shadow Priest. You have the warlocks still being very strong, so overall Shadow Priest, compared to the dominance they have in Mythic Plus, is not nearly as strong in the raid. So we do find ourselves in a situation where after the changes to 10.1.5, you have to start wondering how many of these are going to stick, how many of these are going to remain and continue throughout this patch, or if Blizzard believes that some of these are a little bit over the top. We do obviously only have 3 to 4 days of raiding, so we don't have that many parses yet, we don't have that many results yet. We can still tell though, we can still see clearly, for example, that Augmentation Evoker is of course one of the more tried, one of the more tested spec in the raid. So Devastation of course is taking a big hit in return. Unsurprisingly, we have a pretty even split of mage specs, because of course it's not just one spec that is being changed or one spec that is being reworked. Now you have all 3 of the mage specs receiving some or many changes, so you have multiple mages trying out different specs throughout the bosses. So we still don't have one clear winner in the raid when it comes to mages. Pretty much the same goes for Warlock. Warlock has also gotten some positive changes overall. Even Affliction has started rising in play, even though their power is stronger now for Mythic Class, more so than the raid, but it's still a work in progress for warlocks and for mages to figure out, you know, the better performing one, the stronger one overall in the raid. Most of the other specs still are in the place they were before their slot. For example, we still have the Unmovable Beast Mastery as one of the more popular specs in the raid, even though all hunters continue to be very, very disappointing. Same goes for other specs like Havoc and Fury and Balance Druid, still very popular. That is still remaining the same thing in 10.1.5. It was more interesting to check what was going on with the specs that were changing, the specs that were receiving some changes, to see how this has affected them in the raid. As I said, not nearly as big of a change compared to Mythic Plus, with the exception of Fire Mage, which seems to be having a damage profile which is basically good for all situations. Unlike other specs and other DPS specs, now you see Fire Mages even parsing a terrible 50 percentile, still being ahead of everyone else, and their damage profile being very, very steady, very, very high and very, very steady. So it's the type of damage profile that can do well in pretty much any encounter. Single target, multi-target, AoE, you switch your Pyroblast with your Flame Strike and suddenly you have top AoE damage. So it's just very encompassing of all the type of damage profiles you want to have as a DPS. That's one of the main reasons why Fire Mage is doing so well right now compared to their older version. So much like the question for Mythic Plus, the question now for the raid is going to be how much of this will Blizzard let go? How much of this will Blizzard let stay like this, and for how long before they tune these specs? Now for the raid, it's not nearly as bad to be balancing things now, because now we have 200, 300, 400 guilds already defeating Sarkareth. So, you know, tuning the specs now is not going to affect the race to get cutting edge by any means, but as I said, it's much more relevant in Mythic Plus. So what is going to impact now the balance tuning, because we are far too deep into the race to world 1000, we are far too deep in the raid, that now what's going to matter most is whether or not Blizzard wants to nerf these specs while the Mythic Plus season is going, nerf these specs while the players are, you know, are full busy trying to push keys, right? What's gonna happen if a bunch of players start clearing plus 30 keys and then Blizzard nerfs Augmentation by 20%, Fire Mage by 15%, and Shadow Priest by 20%. Now suddenly you no longer have the power to push plus 30 keys, because the specs that allowed you to push that deep are now nerfed and are not nearly as strong as before. So that is something we have seen Blizzard did not want to do in Season 3 of Shadowlands when they reverted. They paused the nerfs they wanted to give to Destruction. Even after admitting that Destruction was completely broken, they kept it broken, because if they nerfed it at that moment, it would have stopped Mythic Plus players from trying to push higher keys, because those higher keys were only possible with Destruction Warlocks. What's a bit funnier this season, though, is that we are not in a situation where it's just one spec, it's just Destruction Warlock that is far too strong. Now we have Guardian Druid, Holy Paladin, Shadow Priest, Augmentation Evoker, and Fire Mage in the same bucket. So it's gonna be interesting to see what Blizzard is going to be doing to these specs in the next few days/weeks, given their current power. Now, maybe we are all wrong. Maybe we are all overreacting after seeing 4 to 5 days of the patch. Maybe it's gonna come up that Arcane Mage or Frost Mage or Enhancement Shaman had some hidden builds or some hidden synergies they haven't discovered yet, and they will suddenly spike up in power. Maybe someone will come up with a different comp out of nowhere, being much stronger than previously thought, but you know, it looks unlikely. It looks like the player base right now has gotten quite a good idea of which specs are overperforming at the moment or being way too powerful at the moment. So we will see what is Blizzard going to think about it in the near future. But for now, this is the situation we have in the raid just after a few days. We will check later on in 1 or 2 weeks when the situation has settled a little bit more to see how the performance has been going for all the specs. This was the first, preliminary look at the situation in the raid. So on this Sunday, I believe, it's time to leave each other once more, starting by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and help in the growth of the channel. And then, of course, you can still support completely for free. You can like and comment down below to cheat the YouTube algorithm, and then you can also subscribe to the channel itself. With these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, this heat, this 35 degrees heat, should be going away on Monday for just 3 to 4 days, hopefully.